Sambro Island Lighthouse. It's the oldest operating lighthouse in North America, which means it's the oldest original structure still operating. It was built between 1758, it was begun in 1758 and completed in 1760. And the reason it was built was because, and I might add, a scant 9 years after the founding of Halifax Harbour, Halifax, the town of Halifax. The Sambro Ledge is very, very dangerous, and the lighthouse was very important to His Majesty's and later Her Majesty's naval ships transiting to and from this very important British stronghold. So that was the reason for the construction of the lighthouse. There were 10 or 15 principal keepers who kept the light until 1988, and then it was de-staffed, and since then there's been nobody out there. In the early days there was just one lightkeeper there, so there was just one house and some ancillary buildings and the lighthouse itself and the cannons, of course. And later on there were all different types of fog signals, ranging from steam whistle to a acetylene gun to the diaphone, which is a big air horn, to today's electronic horns. So there were different buildings, but right now there is one house, the remains of a second house which was burned by vandals last September, the basement of a third house which was floated ashore in the late 70s and is still there. It's called Henneberry Point now. It's a property that just sold in behind the club at the basin there. There were two sheds in the 80s. There was a gas shed and a tool shed. There was a boathouse. Life in the early days for keepers was really rough. Not only are you on a tiny island, albeit only a mile offshore, but you are isolated offshore and you're exposed to every direction the wind comes from, massive seas that could and quite often did wash right over the island. You had to raise a lot of your own food. There was the uncertainty of getting to shore in a sailboat to get your provisions that you had to get from shore. So life was really difficult. The first years were kind of difficult out at the island because it originally used whale and fish oil as a light source, and it wasn't always that effective. It was smoky, it wasn't very efficient. Abraham Gesner, the famous Nova Scotian from Cornwallis in the center of our province, invented or developed kerosene, and when kerosene started to be used, you had a much better quality light, and Sambro had a first order lens, which you can still see at the Maritime Museum, with a kerosene light which operated very much like a Coleman lantern inside and produced a light that could be seen 20 to 24 miles, a very effective light used until 1967. But still, the sea was a constant concern, especially for Marjorie and John, who had 3 young children, a couple of whom were washed off the rocks and washed back in again. There were all sorts of dangers on that front, and also they were socially isolated in some ways. They were busy in the summertime with a lot of visitors, but in the wintertime the kids had to board in Sambro so that they could attend school because it was just too dangerous to get back and forth. The weather was always an issue too when it came to safely transiting back and forth, and John and Marjorie were actually marooned on a small rock off Sambro Island during a vicious winter storm in the mid to late 70s when their outboards broke down, and Johnny actually had to wade and swim to the island to get to the house, and he had to open the door with his wrists because his hands were frozen, to call the Coast Guard for help to come and get Marjorie on the rock. So from day one to day end, things were really, it was a challenge to live on Sambro Island, but it was also a wonderful experience. Double Alex, or Double Alec as he's known in Sambro, is the resident ghost. Now he was stationed with a garrison of men who basically staffed the 24-pounder cannon, which you can still see on the island to this day. Those cannons were used as fog signals and also as a method of signaling the port of Halifax, the naval authorities, of ship movements. It was a very crude semaphore, if you will, but it was also used as an audible fog signal. And so Double Alex, Alexander, and his comrades took care of these fog cannons, these signal cannon. And the story goes, there's a number of versions of this story, but this would be the mid to late 19th century. He went ashore with the payroll to secure provisions, and he blew it all on wine and women and other. He came back full of remorse. He was roundly chastised by his superiors and apparently, out of remorse, hung himself near the lighthouse. Poor old Alex died, and soon after that the haunting began. Strange figures seen on the beach. The keeper's dog would react very strangely when Alex was around, and right up until the 1980s, late 80s, when John and Marjorie Fairservice, the last keepers, were there, toilets would flush by themselves. They saw someone on the island when no one else was there, or Alex made his presence known until the very end of habitation on that island. And I had a little experience with him too, but it wasn't anywhere as interesting as that. I had gone out to the island in 1988, just before destaffing, with Rip Irwin, a lighthouse historian and friend of mine. And John and Marjorie were there, and Kelly was there, and we spent a great evening. The wind was blowing, the foghorn was on, we ran tape, we heard stories and their memories of their 24 years out there, which was a long time. And we ended up going over to Jerry O'Neill's place. Jerry was the relief assistant keeper, and we had taken out charts earlier in the day to look at charts of Halifax Harbour and the area. They were just lying in a rather neat stack in the living room. And around 3 in the morning, I was upstairs. I woke up, I had to use the bathroom or something, and I heard all this paper shuffling. You could hear all this kind of stuff going on like this, and stuff being flipped over. And I thought, oh, it's just Rip or Jerry down there doing something with the charts. And of course, the next morning I said, geez, that was kind of early in the morning, or late to be up. And they both said, well, we weren't up. So we went down, and the charts were all over the living room floor. There'd been nobody in the house but us, and we were all three of us upstairs in our respective rooms asleep. So we like to think it was Double Alex. So, given its significance as the oldest operating existing lighthouse in the Americas, it really hasn't been treated well. It needs federal involvement at the highest level to develop it into a world-class historic and tourism destination. That has to happen, but it's really difficult these days to make that happen.
What would make that happen?
Groundswell of support from the community and the right people listening on the federal level. Parks Canada, DFO, Coast Guard, those, and the FIBRO, which is the Federal Heritage Buildings Review Office. I mean, they all have to be involved in this. This is a National Historic Site. There's a cairn in front of the St. James United Church in Sambro Village that states that this is a National Historic Site, Sambro Island, and yet the place is it's just been left to rot, more or less, aside from the lighthouse itself. A lot of people like to look at lighthouse and think, oh my gosh, what a beautiful sunsets and the flashing beam of the light and the boom of the foghorn and the romance. And the romance was there. It was a hard job, as I've just told you. There were the elements, the social isolation to deal with, but on the other side, a lot of keepers took a great deal of pride in the service to the mariner, the state of their station with the lawns mowed and the tower and the buildings painted up and the flag snapping in the breeze. A lot of keepers also treasured the close family time that they had, because they were by necessity close. And especially in the wintertime, they were always together. So that was a very important element of light keeping. So I think there was a combination of harsh reality and romance, and a lot of lighthouse keepers will still tell you to this day that the years they spent on the lights were the best they ever had. People really enjoyed working hard and serving the mariner and being close to their families.